Apollo 13 astronauts, spacecraft commander Jim Lovell, lunar module pilot Fred Hayes, and command module pilot Jack Swigert are in no immediate danger.
In 1979, 3 astronauts were sent to the moon to make history, but halfway there, one hidden mistake made 5 years earlier turned their ship into a death trap. In the darkness of space, power began dying. The air turned dangerous, and every second pushed them closer to the point of no return. What followed was a dehumanizing experience that forced them into choices no one ever planned for. Choices that pushed the limits of endurance, logic, and what a human being can tolerate when there is nowhere left to run. The 5-year-old manufacturing error. On April 11, 1970, Apollo 13 launched at exactly 2:13 in the afternoon from the same launch pad where Apollo 11 had lifted off less than a year earlier. The rocket in question was a Saturn V, the most powerful machine ever built up to that point. On top sat 3 spacecraft: the command module, named Odyssey, the service module attached behind it, and the lunar module, named Aquarius, tucked underneath. The crew was made up of 3 men: Commander James Lovell, a Navy captain who had already flown 3 space missions, including Apollo 8, John Swigert, who had been a backup astronaut until just 3 days before launch, when the pilot was pulled from the mission over concerns about German measles, and Fred Hayes, who was making his very first trip to space. Their mission was supposed to be the 3rd moon landing, targeting a hilly area where scientists believed ancient pieces of the moon's crust waited to be collected. The first 2 days of the mission went smoothly. The astronauts checked their systems, adjusted their course, and settled into the routine of spaceflight. On April 13th, they did a television broadcast from the ship, pointing the camera at the inside of the cabin and showing viewers back home how they lived in zero gravity. At the end of the broadcast, Lovell signed off with a friendly goodnight. The crew was in good spirits and everything seemed normal, but this would be the last time anyone heard their voices without a sense of dread. Because 49 minutes later, things took a horrible turn. At 9:08 p.m. Eastern Time, a loud bang shook the spacecraft. At first, no one knew what caused it. The crew saw a warning light that one of their 2 oxygen tanks was reading low. This seemed impossible because those tanks were designed to supply the fuel cells that made electricity and water for the whole mission. They should have had plenty of oxygen left. But then the second tank started dropping too, and within minutes, alarms went off all over the command module. 2 of the 3 fuel cells had died. The crew watched their remaining power drain like water out of a bathtub. The math was brutal. The command module only had about 15 minutes of battery power left, but they needed those batteries for re-entry at the end of the mission. Roughly 10 hours of operation were required. The problem had been waiting for them for 5 years, hiding inside a piece of equipment that no one thought to check. It began with an oxygen tank built in 1965 for Apollo 10, which was dropped to the floor and partially cracked. But instead of replacing the tank entirely, engineers decided to fix it, a mistake that would nearly cost the lives of 3 men. To make matters worse, the tank had heater switches designed for 28 volts, but in 1965, NASA changed the requirement to 65 volts. The company that made the tank never upgraded the switches, and this mismatch sat hidden for years, waiting for someone to flip the wrong switch at the wrong time. On March 30th, 1970, less than 2 weeks before launch, technicians ran a ground test and applied 65 volts. The old switches welded themselves shut, melting the insulation off the fan motor wiring, and no one noticed. This meant that the tank was already damaged before the rocket ever left the ground. So when Swigert flipped the switch to stir the tanks that April evening, the damaged wiring moved. bare wires touched and sparked, and the tank full of pure oxygen under high pressure exploded. The blast blew off a panel on the side of the service module, and 2 of the 3 fuel cells died instantly. They were 200,000 miles from Earth. Their main power was dead, and the only place left to go was a small lunar lander built for 2 men to survive 45 hours. What they would face in the coming days would push these 3 men to the brink of death, fighting the freeze and void. The command module, Odyssey, was dying. Its batteries had maybe 15 minutes left, so the crew shut it down completely. Odyssey went dark and cold, becoming little more than a dead capsule they would need later for re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. To survive, the men had to move to the lunar module, Aquarius, and make it their new home. But there was a problem. Aquarius was never meant for this. It was a 2-stage vehicle designed to land 2 men on the moon for a day and a half. The descent stage carried the landing legs and most of the propellant. The ascent stage was roughly the size of a small bathroom, and inside that bathroom, 3 men would now live for 4 days. To make matters worse, there were no seats. The lunar module had no chairs because on the moon, gravity is 1/6 of Earth's and you mostly float. But standing or floating for 90 hours was extremely exhausting. The men braced themselves against the walls and the equipment, trying anything to stay in one place while they worked. The temperature inside Aquarius also dropped fast. With all non-essential systems powered down to save electricity, the cabin fell to 3 degrees Celsius, just above freezing. Their breath fogged the walls. Condensation formed on every surface, then broke free into floating droplets of water that drifted into their eyes, their equipment, and their food. They shivered constantly. Sleep came in fragments between radio calls and procedure updates, and each man wrapped himself in whatever thermal layers he could find. But the cold was not the worst part. The lack of water was. Water on a spacecraft does more than keep astronauts hydrated. In the lunar module, water also evaporated into space to carry heat away from the electronics. Without enough water, the computers and guidance systems would overheat and fail. So every drop had to do double duty, drinking and cooling. The ration was 6 ounces of water per man per day, less than a single soda can. To give some perspective, the average person on Earth drinks about 60 to 80 ounces a day. But these 3 men were getting 1/10 of that while trying to solve complex navigation problems and keep themselves alive. Fred Hayes paid the price first. Dehydrated and unable to drink enough fluids, he developed a urinary tract infection that spread to his kidneys. He was in pain for most of the return journey, but he never stopped working. There was simply no one to replace him. After splashdown, he would need immediate medical treatment, and the infection would leave lasting effects. Navigation was another problem entirely. They needed to get home fast, but the main engine, the service propulsion system, was sitting on the damaged service module. No one knew if firing it would cause another explosion, so flight controllers made a bold decision. They would use the lunar module's descent engine instead. The engine was designed for one thing: landing softly on the moon. It could throttle down to very low thrust. It was mounted on a gimbal ring for steering, and it produced about 10,000 pounds of force at maximum. Not huge by rocket standards, but enough to push them where they needed to go. The first engine push happened just hours after the explosion. Controllers on the ground calculated a new path that would put Apollo 13 back on what they called a free return trajectory, using the moon's gravity as a slingshot to swing them around and point them toward Earth. Although it worked, the trajectory was extremely slow, and it meant they would run out of water and power long before they got home. So they needed another engine push. As they passed behind the moon, 254 kilometers above the surface, completely cut off from Earth for 30 minutes, they prepared for a second maneuver called pericynthian, plus 2 hours. This engine push would shorten their return time by nearly half a day, but there was a catch. The lunar module's guidance computer had never been programmed for these kinds of maneuvers. It was built for landing, not for deep space navigation. So engineers on the ground had to write new software from scratch, then read it line by line over the radio to the astronauts, who typed it manually into the computer. One mistake in one line of code could send them off course forever. Jim Lovell also used a backup method. He pulled out a handheld navigation tool that measures angles between stars and took sightings through the tiny window of the lunar module. With his wristwatch and a few reference points, he calculated their position by hand to double-check the computer. At one point, he discovered the guidance system had drifted, and his manual fix saved them from missing Earth entirely. By the end of the mission, Lovell would hold 2 unusual records. He became the only human to travel to the moon twice without ever landing. He also set a record for time in space, 715 hours, which meant he had seen 269 sunrises from orbit. But none of those records mattered while they were still drifting through the cold, dark void, running out of water and trying to aim a broken spacecraft at a planet the size of a pinhead. They had solved the navigation problem. They had survived the cold so far. But there was another problem no one had anticipated, a problem with the air they were breathing. And if they didn't fix it fast, they would suffocate long before they ever saw Earth again. The hack that saved them. After the crew swung around the moon and fired the descent engine to speed up their return, a new warning light appeared on the panel, and this one would prove more dangerous than the lack of water they had survived. The ship had a dangerously high amount of carbon dioxide. The air they were breathing was slowly turning poisonous. Every time a person breathes out, they release carbon dioxide. In a room on Earth, that gas drifts away and gets replaced by fresh air. But inside a sealed spacecraft, there is no fresh air. The carbon dioxide builds up, and too much of it causes headaches, confusion, unconsciousness, and even death. To prevent that, spacecraft carry canisters filled with lithium hydroxide, a chemical that absorbs carbon dioxide directly out of the cabin air. But during the Apollo 13 mission, this system ran into a serious problem. The command module, Odyssey, used square canisters, while the lunar module, Aquarius, used round ones. Even though both contained the same chemical and did the same job, they weren't compatible because of their different shapes. The lunar module only had enough round canisters for 2 men to survive for 2 days. But now, 3 men needed to survive for 4 days. Meanwhile, the extra square canisters were stuck in the disabled command module, out of reach and useless. On the ground, a team of engineers led by Ed Smiley began working on a solution. They could not send new parts to the team, so they had to build something using only items already on the spacecraft. They asked the astronauts to list everything on board, and then they picked through that list like a shopping catalog. They found a roll of gray duct tape, 2 bags from inside the spacesuits used for cooling, 2 hoses from the red spacesuits, 2 socks, 1 bungee cord, and the cardboard cover of the flight plan. Ken Mattingly, the astronaut who was supposed to be on this mission but got pulled out 3 days before launch because of measles, worked the problem from a simulator on the ground. He tested every idea before the crew tried it, step by step, failure by failure. After many attempts, they finally created a 19-step solution. First, they placed a cooling bag over a square canister and taped it in place. Then they cut a hole in the top of the bag, the same size as a spacesuit hose, inserted the hose, and sealed it with more tape. To keep the bag from collapsing, they curved the flight plan cover over the top and wrapped everything tightly with more tape. Next, they pushed a sock into the center ventilation hole. This part was crucial because without the sock, air would bypass the filter and carbon dioxide would keep building up. They repeated the process with a second canister as a backup. Finally, they connected a crossover hose, switched the carbon dioxide setting, and turned on the fan. The crew built the thing while floating in a freezing dark cabin, with condensation dripping into their eyes and a kidney infection starting to take hold of Fred Hayes. Finally, the air was clean again. They called their invention the mailbox. It was ugly, and it looked like something built in a garage. But this simple invention was the hack that kept them breathing. Unfortunately, breathing was not the same as landing. They still had to aim a damaged spacecraft at Earth, survive a fiery drop through the atmosphere, and land in the middle of an ocean, all without knowing if their parachutes would even open. 6 minutes of silence. On April 17, 1970, just hours before returning to Earth, the crew of Apollo 13 prepared for one final critical step. For days, they had been using the lunar module as a lifeboat after an explosion crippled their spacecraft. Now, they had to separate from the damaged part of the ship and rely once again on the command module to survive the journey home. As the ship drifted away, Jim Lovell looked out the window and saw the damage clearly for the first time. One entire side of the spacecraft was gone. A panel near the high-gain antenna had been blown out, almost all the way from the base to the engine, with debris hanging loose. It was obvious now that the explosion hadn't come from outside. It had come from within. The oxygen tank had burst from the inside out. But there was no time to dwell on it. The crew now had to move back into the command module Odyssey, the only part of the spacecraft designed to survive re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. The problem was, it had been shut down for 4 days to save power. Inside, it was freezing, and every surface was covered in condensation. Turning it back on in that condition was dangerous. Moisture and electronics don't mix, and it could easily cause short circuits or even a fire. Back in Houston, a team of engineers had rushed to create a step-by-step procedure to bring the module back to life. The checklist was over 500 steps long, written in just a few hours by people who hadn't slept. Nothing about this was normal. In fact, one of the batteries was even expected to fail at the exact moment the parachutes would be needed. Still, the crew had no choice. They powered it up, and one by one, the systems came back. Even the battery stayed alive. Now, they were headed straight for Earth. As the spacecraft began to descend into the atmosphere, a familiar but dangerous phase began. The air in front of the capsule compressed and heated to extreme temperatures, creating a layer of charged gas around it. This always blocks radio signals, causing a temporary loss of communication with mission control. Normally, that blackout lasts about 3 minutes, but this time was different. Because the main engine had been lost, the crew had used the lunar module's engine to guide their return. This put them on a longer, shallower path back to Earth. Instead of diving steeply, they had to skim the edge of the atmosphere. Too steep, and they would burn up. Too shallow, and they would skip back into space. That shallow angle meant the blackout would last longer than usual. In Mission Control in Houston, the team waited. Leading them was Flight Director Gene Kranz, the person responsible for bringing the crew home. He watched the clock as communication cut off. 3 minutes passed, but then the silence continued. No one spoke, and the controllers sat frozen at their consoles, staring at their screens. The blackout stretched to 6 minutes, the longest any of them had ever experienced. Then, suddenly, a voice broke through the static. It was Jack Swigert, and he said, "Okay, Houston." The signal was weak, but it was enough. The spacecraft had made it through re-entry, but they still weren't safe. High above the ocean, the capsule was falling fast. 2 small parachutes were deployed to slow it down, followed by 3 main parachutes. If any of them failed, the capsule would hit the ocean at a deadly speed. But all 3 parachutes held, and at 1:07 p.m. Eastern Time on April 17th, Apollo 13 splashed down safely in the South Pacific Ocean. Waiting nearby was the recovery ship, just 4 miles away. Given everything that had gone wrong, the accuracy of that landing was almost unbelievable. A helicopter arrived overhead and lowered a rescue swimmer into the water. One by one, the astronauts were lifted out of the capsule. The mission lasted 5 days, 22 hours, 54 minutes, and 41 seconds. Afterward, Richard Nixon awarded the crew the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. The mission became known as a successful failure. The crew never landed on the moon, but what they learned saved future missions. Who do you blame for the Apollo 13 disaster? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.